And I'm very pleased to be joined now by Neema Parvini, academic and author of The Populist Delusion. Well, Neema, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me, what is the populist delusion?
Well, thanks for having me, Jacob. The Populist Delusion is a book basically that somewhat challenges the outline of history that you've just given, namely that processes are bottom-up and democratic in the way that you outline. It takes a more realist view of politics and power, which is something that I think that the current moment is actually teaching us in real time. In fact, if I could give my response to the Khan review, it may outline where some of these disagreements about democratic freedoms may lie between us.
Okay. And what I would argue about our Constitution is that almost all our Constitution and developments come about by accident or through conflict. I mean, if you go right the way back to 1265, Simon de Montfort is rowing with the king, and therefore the burgesses are called to Parliament. It isn't some carefully thought through democratic principle. Likewise, Magna Carta is a row between the king and the barons, and that we have developed in this way, but not because anyone sat down and thought it through.
No, I mean, essentially my view is that the history of any country is a history of its elites, and history of essentially rival elite factions. The issue that I have really with, I mean, your history lesson was very interesting, Jacob, and I listened intently. But the idea that the nation is built on democratic freedom, I think, is a little far-fetched. As far as I can see, there has never been any time in history when the ideal of free speech has been achieved. Even if one abolishes religion, one can never abolish political theology, which has a tendency towards absolutism. Free speech tends to be reserved for the friends of those in power and restricted for the enemies of those in power. You mentioned the French Revolution. I mean, you can look at what happened there. Edmund Burke famously tried to ban Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. Our minds instinctively turn to the mass book burnings in mid-century Germany, but it's often forgotten that the Allies also had thousands of German books pulped, and they even had the typesets of the printing presses melted down. During the Cold War, you could not be an open Soviet sympathizer, which is one reason why the left during that time advocated for free speech. People forget that once upon a time, the left were all for free speech. Now, of course, the left is in power everywhere, even as the Tories nominally hold government. And so, of course, conservative opinions are banned. And if I may be frank, Jacob, one of the issues is that nominally conservative institutions, such as the Tory party, refuse to play friend-enemy. They routinely throw people who should be their friends under the bus and end up bowing to the enemy. There's one Tory MP, I'm not going to kind of name her, but let's just say it's a rising Cameronite star. She spent her entire career advocating for gender equality, trans rights, every social justice issue under the sun. I'm sure the audience of this show understands economics. As far as I can see, this person, this MP I'm talking about, is simply responding to incentives, reward and punishment mechanisms. And many people feel that it's the failure of the Conservative Party to wield power for friends and against enemies while in office, which is why a lot of people are saying they deserve 0 seats in the upcoming election. Because
I think you make a very interesting point about how people always want free speech for their side of the argument and try and shut it up for the other side of the argument. I happen to think it's a pity that Russia Today got shut down, because I think you want to listen to people like that Lord Haw, broadcasting in the Second World War, made Nazi Germany look ridiculous. And if you hear from your opponent, you can often lampoon them and you can caricature them very effectively. So I'm very sympathetic to that point. But what do you think about this the report, the Khan report? Do you think it's a helpful contribution to the debate?
Well, I mean, one of the issues, and I hate to say this again, Jacob, is that the government over the past 2 decades, and certainly in the past 14 years, has empowered left-wing activists to behave in the way that the Khan Review outlines with no consequences. I mean, there are certain activist groups, again, I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about, who can essentially smear people like me and you, cost-free, and there is no legal recourse to come back on these people because, frankly, who's going to sue MI5? And it's been made clear that these things are connected because we can read the intelligence reports they do on a regular basis. When George Orwell, who you mentioned, wrote 1984, a lot of people thought he was talking about Stalin's Russia, the Soviet Union. He was actually talking about his own experiences in the British Information Research Department. And he was saying back then that Britain in 1948 was at risk of becoming totalitarian like Russia.
Indeed.
And I'm afraid
and he called it 1984 because his publisher thought 1948 would be too frightening. On that happy note, thank you very much, Neema.